If it weren't for Jesus,
If it weren't for Jesus,
I'd be lost, scared, and alone.
I would have no purpose.
If it weren't for Jesus, I wouldn't know my true worth.
My lust would still be consuming me.
I'd still be empty and broken inside.
I'd be in jail or dead.
I would still be carrying a load of guilt and shame.
my life would still be filled with discontent.
I'd still be filled with loneliness and despair.
But because of Jesus,
I've found hope.
I have found a purpose.
I have found my value in Christ.
I have found freedom.
Because of Jesus, I have been healed.
I'm alive.
I have found peace.
I have found contentment.
I have found joy.
I've been forgiven.
Forgiven for
all my sins.
I have been set free.
All because of Jesus.
Hey, welcome to the porch today. My goodness, it's one of those cold, let me say that again, cold, late fall, early winter days. The air's crisp, it's beautiful, the sun is sharp and clear. It's just gorgeous. And today, we're going to start a new series of conversations. The video that you just watched gives you an idea of what we're going to talk about. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk a little bit about if it weren't for Jesus. You know, we're living in a season and in a day today when we need the message of Christmas more than I believe we've ever needed it before. People are living in fear. There's a thirst that people have, and they're really not sure what they're thirsty for. They think they're thirsting for a new normal. They think they're thirsting for something to return to their lives. But really, if we get right down to it, what people are thirsty for is God. To fill the emptiness that's within them and to find the peace that can only come not from having a normal routine to live, but from knowing that you're in His hands and that you're being watched over by Him. The message of Christmas and how it applies to our situation is one of the most important messages I believe we can hear today. You see, Jesus comes to address our thirst, to interject God into our challenging situation, and to help us see Him. How do we deal with the challenges that are ahead of us? How do we deal with all of the changes that are taking place in life with this reshaped future caused by this election, caused by COVID-19? Are we powerless to do anything about it? And the answer to that is a resounding no. We're not powerless. We have to listen to and apply the message of Christmas every day to our lives. When Jesus first came to address our situation, and He can come again to address our situation in your life if you invite Him. If it weren't for Jesus, we would be powerless. Our world would be gripped by fear, and we would be forced to live in that fear. Remember the first message that the angel shared with the shepherds when they appeared to announce the first message of Christmas? In Luke chapter 2 and verse 9, it said, "And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people." You know, the message that came from the glory that day was joy to all people. It was good news. And the very first words out of the angel's mouth from the glory was, "Fear not, fear not. You are not powerless. You are not a victim of your circumstances. God has your back if you let Him. Well, that brings us to what I want to talk about a little bit today. In this series, we're going to look at how Jesus, in His life and ministry, carried out the message of the angels, the first message of Christmas, and how that applies to our lives. And so today we're going to go to Mark chapter 9, and let me give you a little bit of the background of what's happening. Jesus is coming off the Mount of Transfiguration, is what it's technically called. It was the place where the glory was revealed. Just like the angel spoke from the glory and said, "Fear not," Jesus walked out of that glory with Peter, James, and John. He'd left 9 disciples at the foot of the mountain, and He comes from the mountain, from the glory, to see those disciples. And while He's been on the mountain, certain things have happened. And so we see Jesus from the glory teaching us that we do not have to be powerless. And I want to read through the whole account so that we can get our minds around it and just kind of see exactly what we're talking about here. And we're starting in Mark chapter 9 and verse 14, Mark 9:14. And He asked them, this is Jesus, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered Him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And He answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to Him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the father said, "From his childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, He rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he entered the house, His disciples asked Him privately, "Well, why could we not cast it out?" And He said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." And in most Greek texts it says, "but by prayer and fasting." You see, the picture here is of this father and his son, and it's a tragic picture indeed. In fact, it's recorded in 3 of the Gospels. With the exception of Jesus, everybody involved in this situation is powerless. Luke tells us that it's the father's only son. And so here's a desperate father with a demon-possessed boy, and the son is at the mercy of this spirit, causing him to be dumb, sometimes throwing him into the fire or into the water, causing him to foam at the mouth or to bite his tongue, and at times even trying to destroy this young boy. And nobody all these years has been able to do anything for this young lad. It is a tragic and pitiful picture. But whenever I read this account, I'm struck by the tragedy of it all. But the greatest tragedy is not the possessed boy. This possessed boy is not the reason the Holy Spirit had 3 gospel writers record this account. The Lord is saying more to us than just telling us about the fact that this boy was inhabited by a demon. The tragedy, the greatest tragedy of this story is not the possession of the boy, but the powerlessness of the disciples to do anything about it. Satan is using this boy to defeat the disciples. And that's the point the Holy Spirit wants to make in this record. The pitiful part of the story is not that there's a boy possessed by an evil spirit, but that those who are supposed to do something about it are unable to do anything about it. Jesus walks up, and as he comes from the glory and meets His disciples, He said, "What are you arguing about?" And the father said, "I brought my boy to your disciples and that they could cast out the demon." And He says in Mark 9:18, but they were not able. Draw up a minute here. I want to talk to you about something. I really believe with all my heart the church is busying itself today answering a lot of questions that the world has never asked and the world could care less about. I'm convinced that the world has only one question that it wants answered by the church. And it's not how many were in church last Sunday, and it's not what was your offering last Sunday. It's not what your next event is going to be on the calendar or how are you handling the virus. I'm convinced the only thing the world is interested in is, can you cure my boy? Can you help me? Can you do something for me in this helpless situation? To answer that, we have to get a clear picture of the power at our disposal. You see, the world comes to Jesus and says, look, I brought my life to your disciples. They couldn't do anything. I found them busy about a lot of things and making a lot of plans, having a lot of goals and programs. I brought my broken home to them and my addicted child to them, my enslaved life to them to help find assistance and deliverance. But they were not able. The difference between what we are and what we ought to be, I think, can be summed up like this. We're moved to temper over the sinfulness of this age, the horror of what we see around us, when we ought to be moved to tears by the helplessness of most churches to do anything about it. The tragedy of our age is not COVID-19. It's not the election. It's not the opioid crisis. It's not the pornography industry. It's not all of the sexual deviance that we're seeing in the world around us. No. The tragedy of our age is that the church appears to be powerless to do anything about any of it. Some things result when the church is powerless. There's confusion among the disciples. I mean, the Father said to Jesus in Mark chapter 9 and verse 18, and whenever it sees him, it throws him down and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. They here in the original language is plural. And so I'm assuming that every disciple had a go at it. Disciples begin to deal with this boy, and one by one they realize that they can't handle it. It's beyond them. And they had the gift that was given them by God to deal with this situation. And one by one the disciples failed, and so they're thrown into utter confusion. And so the only thing the disciples know to do at this point is to have a dialogue with the world and the religious people. The scribes and the disciples are talking when Jesus arrives on the scene. As verse 14 says, they're arguing among themselves about what to do. You see, when you consult the world about what the church is supposed to do, it will bring confusion. Utter confusion occurs among God's people, and you see it in churches everywhere today when churches listen to anybody who has a better idea, because then that brings doubt to the people of the world. We should be listening to God, and we should be elevating His Word above popular opinion and above whatever the religious crowd is saying. In fact, in Mark chapter 9, verse 22, the Father says, this demon has cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us. You see, the Father sees the inability of the disciples to do anything to help him. And so he comes to Jesus, and look at what he says to Jesus. Look at this verse carefully. He says, but if you can do anything. You see, now the Father doubts whether or not Jesus can do anything because of the disciples' ineffectiveness. And Jesus responds in verse 23 and says, if you can, like, come on, really? You're really questioning whether or not I can handle this? Listen to me, listen carefully. Draw up here and hear what I'm saying. The world today doubts whether Jesus can do anything because the world has observed the church's ineffectiveness. And so what happens is Jesus takes over the situation and he heals the boy. And then verse 28, it says, and when he entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, saying, well, why couldn't we cast it out? Why couldn't we do something about this? You see, I don't blame them. I would have come to him privately too. They honestly don't know. They don't know what the problem here is. Let me tell you what my prayer for you today is. As we engage in this conversation here on the porch today, my prayer for you is that you're not just going to be listening to this conversation or involved in it, but that you will know how to satisfy your thirst for God so that you will settle for nothing less than God's power in your life. The disciples came to Jesus and asked him what was wrong. They just couldn't believe that the problem was them. And Jesus responded to the disciples by saying in verse 29, he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer and fasting. Notice how he says it. He says, this kind. It gives the implication that there were lesser problems that the disciples had dealt with in the past, but this kind requires something more than you've been accustomed to giving. And I believe in these days that we live in today, we are meeting this kind of situations that require us to be prepared before the situation ever arises. You're dealing with this kind of challenges in your own life. And the political correctness, the liberal agenda, the response to COVID-19 that we see going on in our world today is not going to help you handle it. There have been times in churches in the past when with very little effort they were able to enjoy victory, but those days are past. I'm convinced that today we're meeting this kind of situation, and it requires something more than we as churches have been accustomed to giving, and that we as people have been accustomed to giving. What kind of power is needed today to escape the indictment of this world and to deal with this kind? We must be people who have satisfied their thirst for God, who live out the first message of Christmas, who fear not and live the good news of great joy, who are not thirsting for God but empowered by God. If it weren't for Jesus, you'd have no power, and we would definitely live in fear. Absolutely. Reminds me of the story of a second lieutenant. He was thirsty. And it happened to Fort Bragg. He's walking up to a vending machine to get him something to drink out of it. And a private happens to be walking by. And so he turns, looks at the private, and he says, Private, do you have change for $5? And the private responds, I think so. Let me take a look. Immediately, that second lieutenant looked that private in the eye, dressed him down, and said, Soldier, that's no way to address an officer. Now we'll start all over again. Do you have change for $5? Smartly, that private came to attention. He saluted, and he looked at the lieutenant square in the eye, and he said, No, sir. He about-faced and walked away. And the second lieutenant stood there, realizing that he wasn't going to get his thirst satisfied, because he insisted on handling things by a certain protocol. Listen to me. A failure to properly use the power that has been placed at your disposal will leave you thirsting for God and unable to help yourselves or others. Yes, God's given you power, just like that second lieutenant had power. But if you misuse that power, mishandle that power, don't apply that power properly, then you're going to miss experiencing the presence and power of God in your life. And you find yourself not having freedom from fear at all. That brings us to what I want to talk about today. That's just kind of the introduction. Just took us time to get there. I want us to look today at the fact that if you refuse to live in fear, when you apply God's power to your life in three ways. You refuse to live in fear when you apply God's power to your life in three ways. Number one, the first thing is you recognize that God is all you need to meet your challenge. God is all you need to meet your challenges. Jesus steps on the scene, and when he does, all the confusion dissipates when he takes over. There's no hesitation on his part. Jesus said, just bring me that boy, and he takes care of it. You see, Jesus addressed the demon that he confronted his disciples. He said, you get out of that boy, don't you come this way again. And he spoke with total authority, and the Gospel of Matthew tells us that the boy was cured from that very moment. It immediately happened. And Jesus obviously is upset with his disciples because they had access to the same power, the power that you and I must operate by, the only power that can address the challenges of life that we face. Let me tell you something. Listen to what I'm going to say. Every single one of us has faced situations that we feel are hopeless. Maybe you're going through it right now. Maybe this virus has exaggerated and made even stronger these hopeless situations in your life. But I want you to notice what Jesus asks this father about the boy. Mark 9:19, he says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" And then Jesus looks at the father, and here's what he says to the father. His instructions to the father, "Bring him to me." In verse 20, they brought the boy to him, and immediately when the demon sees him, the scripture says in verse 20 that it convulsed the boy, and the boy fell on the ground, and all this began to happen. Now, when all this happens, you would immediately expect Jesus to get the demon out of the boy. The boy's convulsing on the ground, he's foaming at the mouth, he's rolling around, but Jesus stops before he even addresses the boy, and he asks the father a question. Verse 21. Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the father responded, "From his childhood." Now, if Jesus asked this question to the father, isn't that strange? Why would he ask that? Didn't Jesus know how long that demon had been there? Sure he knew. But Jesus wanted the crowd that was present to know that this was a hopeless situation. This boy had been this way all his life, and this problem was deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched. It's a hopeless situation. How many hopeless situations do you have in your life that have been that way for a long time, that have been exacerbated by this virus even? You see, our spiritual heritage is a heritage of people who faced hopeless situations with authority and with power. Moses in a hopeless situation at the Red Sea with the Egyptian army breathing down his neck, but the Red Sea opens. At Jericho, the hopeless situation, but the walls came tumbling down. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the hopeless situation of being thrown into a fiery furnace, but they came out without even the smell of smoke on their clothes. All through the Word of God, we see hopeless situations. But never, one time, when a man with God upon him ever walked away from that hopeless situation with anything less than total victory. I want you men to listen to me for a little bit. I'm just about done with effeminate men being held up as the example of what men ought to be in our culture today. I think we should be men who operate with power and the power of God upon our lives. Philip Brooks said it well. Listen to this. He said, quote, "Do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger men. Do not pray for tasks equal to your power. Pray for powers equal to your tasks. Then the doing of your work shall be no miracle, but you shall be a miracle. Every day you shall wonder at yourself, at the richness of life which has come to you by the grace of God." That's my desire. Not to see a miracle as I face the challenges and hopeless situations of life. I want to be a miracle. And to know that I have become one because of the power of God operating in my life. Let me tell you what happens when hopeless situations are not dealt with. Just as in this situation, hopeless situations undealt with become hell strongholds. And that's what happened here. Whether or not you realize it, you and I are engaged in a spiritual war. Paul says it best. Ephesians 6:12, he says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities and against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." There are powerful, dark forces, dark, demonic forces at work in this world. Now, I'm not trying to throw you some kind of a scare tactic or anything like that. But this is why Paul also said in that same chapter, Ephesians 6:10, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might." Do you know why some of you are losing the battle? Because you haven't even been showing up for the war. You've been losing by forfeit. And while we have forgotten that this is a spiritual battle, we end up trying to fight it on a physical plane. But somewhere, lurking in the shadows of your hopeless situation, is Satan himself. You know that 100 lightning bolts strike every second, representing 8 million daily surges of power. In fact, even though 3/4 of those lightning bolts' energy is heat, 55,000 degrees Fahrenheit, they still deliver a full 25 million volts of electricity, which is amazing. With a lightning bolt traveling at 90,000 miles per second, with channels of pulsating energy over 2 inches wide, going from the ground to the clouds, because that's the way lightning goes, the power that is released is more than all of the generators generating electricity combined in the United States on an annual basis. Like the physical phenomenon of lightning, tremendous spiritual energy is released when the prayers of God's children start pulsating toward heaven. Most believers are not even on the battlefield, because let me tell you, the war's fought on your knees. That's where it is won. Face your situation with God. He's all you need to face your challenge. 1 John chapter 4, verse 4 says it best. Little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. Jesus will sustain and strengthen you if you'll trust him. George Bush was quoted in an article some time ago in the Washington Post about a powerful situation that he witnessed. It happened during the funeral of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Things were run during the funeral to a military precision, and it all happened in 1987, really just 2 years before the Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan, and just 4 years before it eventually completely broke up. But during that 1987 funeral, they were still very, very, very strong and powerful. The Soviet military machine was on full display at the funeral. It was cold, it was hollow. There were marching soldiers and steel helmets and Marxist rhetoric, but no prayers, no comforting hymns, no mention of God. And George Bush says, quote, I happened to be in just the right spot to see Mrs. Brezhnev. She walked up to the casket, took one last long look at the body of her husband, and there in the cold gray center of that totalitarian state, she traced the sign of the cross over her husband's chest. George Bush said, I was stunned. In that simple act, God had broken through the core of the communist system. Recognize that God is all you need, no matter what the challenge. And the power of God, even more powerful than the mighty Soviet Union, the evil empire that today is gone, but God's power still operates. Number one, if you want to refuse to live in fear and apply God's power to your life, then you must first of all recognize that God is all you need to meet your challenges. Number two, you let God work in your life to achieve your potential. You let God work in your life to achieve your potential. You know, you very seldom ever see Jesus grow impatient with anyone, but I want you to notice what he says, and he's publicly addressing this directly to his disciples. He says in Mark 9:19, O unbelieving generation, Jesus replied, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Primarily speaking to his disciples, Jesus is just filled with righteous indignation. I mean, he's upset. And why was he so upset? Why was he so put out? Because the power to do what needed to be done had been made available to the disciples. When he sent them out in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 8, listen to what he said. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without paying. Jesus had already given them the power to deal with this situation. Every disciple had the power. You know, when you and I stand before Jesus, God's not going to judge us simply on the basis of what we have done, but on the basis of what we could have done, but failed to do because we did not put His power into operation. You know, as you read through the Bible, Jesus always issues strong attacks on unused potential. In fact, in Matthew chapter 21 and verse 18, it says, in the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. He seen a fig tree there by the wayside. He went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither at once? One day Jesus cursed a fig tree because it hadn't produced fruit. And what Jesus was basically attacking was the unused potential of that fig tree. You see, Jesus doesn't want something around that is not realizing its potential. In John 15 verse 2, Jesus says, every branch in me, and we are the branches. And Jesus says, in me, those of us who belong to Him, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes that it may bear more fruit. Are you realizing the potential that God has given you? Are you fruitless? God wants you to grow to your potential. He'll make the power available to you to do what you need. You know, I don't even know if they're going to have the Tournament of Roses parade this year on New Year's Day. Maybe not, with the virus going on. But I was reading the other day an interesting account of, in one of the recent past parades, the entire parade had to be held up because one particular float sputtered to a stop. And they realized the float, the engine driving it, had run out of gas. And so they immediately had to run out and get a tank of gas. They brought it up, they put it in the float, and then the float began to move and the entire parade began to move again. Now here's the irony of it all. That float was the Standard Oil Company float. With all the vast reserves of gas at its disposal, it still ran out of gas. You know, I think sometimes we Christians, with all the vast store of power at our disposal, find ourselves running out of gas and not bearing fruit because we don't let God work in our lives by His power to help us achieve the potential He wants us to achieve. And then finally, you recognize, first of all, that God is all you need to meet your challenges. You, number two, let God work in your life to achieve your potential. And then to know the power of God so that you can live without fear. Number three, you deepen your relationship with God by prayer and fasting. The disciples came to Jesus and asked, Master, why couldn't we cast him out? And Jesus responded in verse 29, He said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer, and then fasting is added in the original language. Jesus didn't say this gift comes out by the gift I gave you in Matthew 10. He says you may have every advantage that God can give to man. You may have that gift, but this kind only goes out by prayer and fasting. In other words, Jesus said, yes, I gave you a gift, but you had to go a step further. You had to seek in prayer the Father. You had to come in fasting. It would have been a lot easier if Jesus just said, hey, this kind only goes out by preaching. No, it only goes out by prayer and fasting. And, you know, isn't it interesting? Jesus never taught His disciples how to preach. He taught them how to pray. Because prayer is more important. You see, how did this... Now think about it for just a minute, okay? How did the disciples have time to fast when all of a sudden they found themselves dealing with this boy that needed help? You know, when this fellow brings his son to you to be helped, you can't all of a sudden say, wait, time out, I'm going on a fast right now. You don't have time. So what was Jesus saying? Let me tell you what Jesus was saying. Jesus was saying, fellas, when you see the enemy coming, it's too late to load your gun. You should be already ready. You should be loaded and ready. Jesus is saying you should have met this situation from a platform of preparedness by prayer and fasting. Your life should have been saturated with the presence of God through prayer and fasting. You should have been ready, armed, and able. Prayer and fasting allows you to acquire the power of God in what you do. In fact, the Bible tells us in James chapter 5, using the example of Elijah, it says Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. In other words, he was like us, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. And then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Elijah prayed, send the rain, and God did. And, you know, if you and I are spending time in prayer and fasting, and I do believe in fasting as well, you would have the power to deal with your hopeless situation. Let me tell you what else would happen. You would not let your hopeless situation become hell strongholds. There's only one reason why hopeless situations are not cured and why hell strongholds are not conquered in your life and in my life, because we're not willing to pay the price in seeking God's face in prayer and fasting. Because we're not willing to fall on our faces. Jesus says this only comes out by prayer and fasting. You say, well, I don't have time to pray. I'm too busy. But you have time to do other things. You have time to sit down and watch TV. You have time to do this. Now, look, I'm not saying go on a 40-day fast. But what if you decided to skip a meal and to spend, in place of that meal, time speaking to God? You know, the only way you're going to acquire the power of God is by spending that time alone with God. Why won't a man pray and fast? Because his heart's facing the wrong direction. He's longing for the wrong things. He's out of place. That's why Jesus says in Matthew that Jesus looked at his disciples and called them a perverse generation. That word perverse means to face the wrong direction. A man's feet always follow his heart. Where's your heart? Where is it? Have you spent some time with God this week to apply His power to your life? Have you skipped a meal? Now, I'm not saying do it without a doctor's attention if you have medical issues, but I am saying spend some time alone with God. And let me tell you where to begin. Begin with the prayer of this overwhelmed father. Mark 9:24. When Jesus confronted him, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, listen to this, I believe, help my unbelief. This father acknowledged that his faith was inadequate, that he needed Jesus' help. And Jesus did not rebuke the father for that prayer, but he immediately took care of his son. He wanted his disciples to have power with God. That's why he taught his disciples to pray, and that's why you and I must be prayer warriors. Let me tell you something. Churches will emerge from this virus on fire and experience a movement of God if they are a praying people. Jesus told his disciples in response to this in the book of Matthew, he said to them that if they just had the faith of a mustard seed, Matthew 17:20, they could have moved a mountain. Listen to me. The message of that first Christmas was, fear not. Out of the glory, the angel announcing Jesus' birth and his interjection into this world, that first Christmas said, fear not. And Jesus, radiating from the glory, demonstrated the power available to us through prayer by demonstrating that we did not have to live in fear, but we could live by power. Several years ago, I was pastoring in East Tennessee, and read about a small congregation in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains that encountered a major problem when they built their new church. A church member had willed the growing church some property so they could relocate, and so they did, and the church members got together. They built a brand new sanctuary, and they were so excited. And then the building inspector came. They were getting ready to open the next Sunday, and the building inspector told them that their parking lot was too small for the size of the building. And he informed the pastor that they could not occupy the facility until they doubled the parking. And unfortunately, they'd already used every usable foot of their property because they backed up to a mountain. And so their situation seemed hopeless. The church called a special meeting with fasting, asked the church members to fast for a day, and then they got together and they prayed. And they prayed to have a mountain-moving faith. Several people showed up, many people, and for 3 hours they prayed, and for that day they fasted. The pastor stood up and he announced, "We'll open next Sunday as scheduled." Well, the following morning, the pastor was there in his office when suddenly there was a knock at the door. He went to the door and there was a man who introduced himself and said that he was a local contractor and he was coming with a unique request. He said, "I'm building a shopping mall just down the road and we are in dire need of fill dirt." And he said if the church would be willing to sell us the dirt from that mountain on the back of their property in exchange for something that is needed immediately, he said, "We'll level the surface and we'll pave it for you at no charge." And so the mountain movers' prayer had been answered, and their church was packed for the dedication service the next Sunday with a brand new paved parking lot. That's the example of God's power at work. God's ready to pour Himself out for you, but you must trust Him. You tired of thirsting? Tired of your hopeless situation? Then why don't you pray the prayer of this Father? Lord, help my unbelief. Would you bow with me right now? Please, just bow with me. And if you've never made a surrender of Jesus personally, to come to know Him, then there's no better time than right now so that you too could have access to His power. Jesus said, "I'm knocking at the door, and if you'll open the door of your heart, I'll come in, and I'll be there with you." Right now, just right now. Pray this with me if you would, please. Dear Jesus, I need You in my life. I'm tired of this hopeless situation. I'm tired of the challenges that I'm facing. I'm tired of feeling defeated. And I'm tired of making mistakes. Please forgive me. And right now, Jesus, I invite You to come into my heart. I surrender my life to You. Thank You, Jesus. Listen to me. Just like one person did last week, if you prayed that prayer with me and you meant it, just put a message down there in the comment section. I prayed that prayer. And then we want to help you understand how to best appropriate the power of Jesus in your life. Listen, I'm so glad to have you with us today. So glad that you're a part of these Porch Talks. Do me a favor, share these with your friends. Get them to watch and to be a part of this so that they too can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to continue our conversation next week as we're talking about if it weren't for Jesus, as we look together at the message of Christmas. God bless you. You have a great time, and I'll look forward to seeing you again real soon.